Hi, in the second part of the video what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take a transaction log backup, and we're also going to go ahead and perform the restore operations required to bring the database back online. A transaction log backup basically comes in two different types. The first one being the actual transaction log backup, where we go ahead and take backups of the transaction log file in regular intervals. The second one is known as a tail log backup. A tail log backup is usually performed at the end of a database restore operation in order to bring the database back to a particular known point in time. In this case, the point in time would be the last known good state. An example of this would be where we go ahead and have a database running operationally in a production system. However, for some unknown reason, the database crashed. At this point, we could have some amount of data loss, assuming that the last transaction log backup was taken approximately 10 minutes ago. In this case, it may not always be desirable to lose the last 10 minutes worth of information, so at that point we are left with the option of taking a transaction log backup or a tail log backup in order to go ahead and try to restore the database to the last good known point in time just before the event occurred that caused the database to crash. This particular tail log backup allows us to go ahead and restore the database to a point just before the damage happened, and therefore we can still bring the database back up to at least a fairly reasonable working condition. In order to do this, what we need to do is we need to go ahead and right click on the database, go to tasks, go to backup, and then under the backup type choose transaction log backup. In this scenario, I'm going to go ahead and add the transaction log backup to an existing backup file. As you can see here, my existing backup file already contains a full and two differential backups. When I go ahead and choose transaction log backup, you'll see that now we have two additional options that are enabled as part of the transaction log. The first one is to go ahead and just truncate the transaction log. This is by default the operation that we would choose when we go ahead and perform a normal transaction log backup. However, as I mentioned before, you might also need to go ahead and occasionally back up the tail portion of the log file in order to go ahead and restore the database to a good last working condition. Let's go ahead and try both of these options now. First, I'm going to go ahead and take a normal transaction log backup by just selecting the truncate transaction log. And I go ahead and press OK. And then it's gone ahead and done. A key thing to remember here is that when you're taking a transaction log backup, the database should not really have any other additional transactions or connections established to it. This is the case when you're going ahead and taking a database backup of the transaction log file known as a tail log backup. Again, let's go ahead and choose transaction log file, and this time let's go ahead and choose the option to back up the tail portion of the log file. Obviously, as it mentions here, it says that once we take the tail log backup, the database will be in a restoring state. Let's go ahead and press OK. As soon as we do that, we see that yes, the database is in a restoring state because we've just gone ahead and taken the tail portion of the log file as a backup. So it means that we need to restore this back before we can bring the database back online. Now, considering this, let's go ahead and delete this database to simulate something like a disaster scenario where the database has crashed completely. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to go ahead now, pretend that this is a different instance altogether, and I'm going to go ahead and restore the database. I'll do this by going ahead and selecting restore and then navigating to the backup folder. In this particular scenario, the backup folder is this particular default folder, and I've got a backup file already listed there, so I'm going to select it, press OK, and press OK. As soon as I do that, you'll see that it's listed the differential log file, the full log file, the transaction log file, and the tail log backup, as you can see here. A new feature that's available in SQL 2012 is the timeline function. In timeline, what happens is that you're actually given the option of being able to go ahead and browse the backup set to view the different data set or view the different data points or timestamps available to which you can restore. If you notice, you'll see that we have the ability to restore the database to the last known good state or the last backup taken, or we can even go ahead and restore to a specific point in time. If you select that option, you can actually move the pointer down here to restore to any specific point in time at which you think the database needs to be available. The timeline functionality has different intervals, so if you look, we can choose week. It's all compressed here and you really can't make out the details. But if you choose hourly, you can see that I've got the full backup, after which I've taken one differential, two differential, and then I've got my transaction log backups here. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and choose last backup taken as the default because I'm trying to restore the database to the last known good state. So go ahead, press OK. I'm going to go ahead and first demonstrate how you would go ahead and restore the database using just the full and differential backups, and then we will go ahead and try to restore the additional transaction log backups shortly after. Again, since this database does not already exist or has been restored as a brand new operation or a brand new database, I'm going to leave this operation as it is. If the database files already exist, you'll need to go ahead and choose override, or else you'll get an error when you're trying to restore the database. The override button is here. In this scenario, as I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to restore not just the database full and differential files, but I'm also wanting to go ahead and restore the transaction log files. In order to do that, I need to go ahead and choose an option other than the one that says restore with recovery. If you choose restore with no recovery, what happens is that it goes ahead and restores the database, but also goes ahead and makes the database unavailable, because until you go ahead and restore all the files associated with the backup, the database will not be available. On the other hand, I may not be sure about the kind of data or the operation that happened in my tail log backup, and therefore might want the option to be able to restore to a previous transaction log file. In this scenario, I would go ahead and choose something called restore with standby, at which point it would generate something called a standby file, which is actually a backup with the uncommitted transactions available in order I want to go ahead and do an undo operation. We will look at this in a moment, but for the moment let's just go ahead and leave it as it is and choose restore with standby and then press OK. As you can see, when we take the backup, you get the status on the top. So it's done with the full and the differential. And as soon as I've done that, you'll notice that the database is available as a read-only, and therefore I can actually now go ahead and query the database and get data out of the database in order to go ahead and script certain reference data. This is especially useful when you're not sure what caused the problem and you just want to make sure that the data is safely out of the database in case you want to rebuild the system from scratch. As you can see here, I can definitely query the database, but I will not be able to perform any insert operations into the database because it's in a standby mode and therefore not fully available. As you can see, it says the database is read-only. Now that I have the database, and assuming that I've scripted the data out of the database, the next thing I want to do is try and restore the database to its working condition. In order to do this, I have two options. The first one is to just go ahead and restore from the standby file, and the second one is to complete the log sequence and restore the chain log, the transaction log file and the tail log backup.